had the pleasure of working with ad agencies for all of our careers, and given the premise of our book, which is to generate awareness of the little things that matter, but very importantly, call men into the conversation. This is not about calling men out, it's about calling men in. So we think this is a great opportunity to talk to respected leaders in the advertising industry about this industry in particular, with the challenges of creating inclusion and knowing how important diversity of thought is to great creative success, why there are systemic barriers to bias, and how do we make progress. So that's our premise. And we'd love to get your point of view on a couple of questions that we have.
Sure.
And maybe starting with...
I'm just nervous.
We're friends though. Friends for FODs.
I started that way to make you feel good. Now you...
No.
Friend of the band.
And hopefully one of the things you've learned from us is that we're really trying to listen and learn as we want others to do as well. And so, as a leader in the ad industry, what's been your experience with bias? Why do you think there's so many barriers that need to be dismantled, and what do you think could make progress happen faster?
So I have a particular view of bias and diversity, and I think Mitzi said it great before. To me, diversity is the easiest fix. And gender diversity is the most easy fix. Mm-hmm. And why do I say that? Because I have yet to go to a corporate meeting where somebody doesn't put up this slide that says, what are you talking about? We got 50%. Sometimes 70%. Mm-hmm. Because very often in a lot of companies, particularly in the ad industry for sure, the incoming class is often predominantly women. Mm-hmm. It just is, right? So that it's just kind of interesting. What happens though over time, as you get up, and we all know this, call it glass ceiling, call it steel ceiling, call it whatever you want to call it, but it changes, right? And it changes for a lot of reasons. Some of them are really good, like women do have children and take off a year, or not. I mean, back in the day, it was, in my time, nobody got a year, nobody got 6 months. Fathers didn't get a day. Mm-hmm. I had to take off, like literally, I had to make a big deal about leaving for the birth. I mean, that's kind of how it was in those days, right? So I think that diversity, to me, is not always the issue. It's much more about inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the real issue. I also look at it, so I'm very involved in the Special Olympics. As you know, Special Olympics is about children who have intellectual development issues. And so I always say you have to turn the pyramid upside down, meaning that if gender is the base of my pyramid, that's always the easiest to solve. Because, so you're a little uncomfortable around women, not really, and people have bad habits, I think. I think younger people less is my view. I think because they're, as we were talking about before, because they're much more used to fluidity, not in the sexual sense, but fluidity of, I had a doll. Like nobody told me it wasn't a good thing, right?
Yeah. They had broader roles.
Or I had, we were talking before, when you play games, very often on the video games, they just assign you a male or a female role and you can't do it. So I think but if I look at that as the start, and then the middle would be race, religion, starts to get a little uncomfortable, maybe, I can understand that more. ID is the most challenging. It makes everybody super uncomfortable. So I always say, turn it upside down. If you can solve that problem, we can solve all the other problems. So that's sort of a not direct answer, but one that I actually speak about a lot, because I think it's a direct answer, that to me, the issue is not just, and by the way, which is why I like the book, and I'll explain in a second, it's not just about talking about gender. Because I think if we do, we're missing out on issues that are equally as important and maybe more important in a sense, because they're harder to solve. What I love about this is this notion of the microaggressions. Because I think that if you can, and it's important to start in a place that doesn't make people as uncomfortable. And so if I can solve this, then I can solve the rest. So this is kind of flipping the pyramid back again the other way,
that.
if you see what I'm saying. So I think the numbers game, I think this is a mistake to start with gender.
Yeah, interesting.
But in terms of just the inclusion, because if I can include ID, hell, I'm going to include women, it's not a problem. But I think when you start thinking about the microaggressions, if I start with the easier stuff,
Yeah.
it encourages me, it sensitizes me, it wakes me up, and it makes me much more available to listen to all my other issues.
Yeah.
I think. I don't know if you agree, but that's kind of,
Yeah, I like it.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it really reinforces what we've been saying, which is if you focus on the numbers, that's not the big problem to solve. So one of the things you mentioned and we talked about was it's not just the numbers, but getting women in leadership and getting diversity of thought in leadership in the creative industry. What's been your experience? How proactive do men have to be to help women rise up in the organization?
I think I have to be very proactive, and I'll tell you why. I think, again, sometimes I look at it and I wonder, okay, like, what's the big deal? Like, how come they haven't risen? And then you look and you say, well, and I think I told you this before, I've worked for mostly women, which is kind of interesting coming up in my career. And many of my clients, if not most, were women. So sometimes I look at it and say, I don't get it, because I know the woman CEO, right? I know the woman CMO, I know, whoever. But the truth is, when you look around the room, which is different, you can also be fooled because you can sit at the table and be a lot of women. But then when you go into your ELT meeting, there's not. And so the question always comes down to, is it on purpose? Was it unconscious bias? Or was it really that we lost out on a level someplace for whatever reasons, and there just weren't enough women? So when you think about what the pool, it actually is not that bad, or maybe not bad at all.
Yeah.
So I think that it's incumbent upon men and women, by the way, to make sure that the next cohort has the visibility to understand that they can do that, right? So I know it's always a joke. You can be president. So we haven't seen that yet, but we will. I just think that that's the issue, right? You always have to have visibility. I mean, we see this with people of color. We see this with every kind of diversity and inclusion you can imagine. The biggest issue is I don't see anybody like me.
Right.
And when you don't see people like you, it's very hard to envision yourself
That's right.
climbing that ladder. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to give women, because that's what we're talking about here, to give women front and center, to not say, take the notes, unless they're the best note taker, which is a separate issue. But I think you have to be really, I think it has to be very proactive. Because again, it's the issue of, I heard it yesterday in a meeting I was sitting at, the woman president of an organization, and she was talking about how something happened, right? People did something. And so it was myself and someone else who were having this discussion with her. It's like, well, how could that be? You're the president. And she said, yeah, that's what my husband said, but I didn't know how to stop it. And I realized that the problem was that she didn't have the self-confidence to think that she could stop it. Now, maybe it was that she wanted to be better liked. Maybe she was just concerned because she is a woman in this president's role, and it is very visible, and she has a lot of, But that thing, knowing that I was coming here today to speak with you, that just sort of stuck in the back of my head, that was a real issue. Because now, it's not to say that I don't know guys who would do the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Who would say, well, I don't know, because they want to be liked, they don't want to do it. It works both ways.
Right.
But I think that in that case in particular, I was very conscious of the fact that she said, my husband told me the same thing. And I realized that was the problem. She just didn't have that self-confidence.
I mean, I've been lucky to have a number of leadership roles in my career.
And now in writing this book and thinking back on circumstances that I encountered, I now have more confidence than I had even when I got some of those leadership roles. And I would handle things differently today than how I handled them then. And even if you're in a seat of power, there's still an aspect about, do you feel comfortable asserting it in certain circumstances?
But I would hope that we all feel that way. That we all feel that need to grow, and how, what my 21-year-old self did in the company when they used to lock me in a room so I wouldn't make too much noise, to today. You hope that you grew and you learned something along the way. Not everybody does, as we know.
I hope to continue learning.
Sadly. But.
So one last question, and building on the idea that a little awareness goes a long way, and a lot of the men that we talk to, once they read these scenarios, they say, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. Now that I know, I will pay attention, I will be proactive. Another reaction we get, though, is that men are sometimes embarrassed to say something or worried that they're going to say the wrong thing. What advice would you give to them?
The advice is, if you're worried you're going to say the wrong thing, then you got a big problem. I think that's the issue, right? If you have to worry about what you're going to say, it's two kinds of worry, right? There's the woke worry, which escapes me, because I think it's killing innovation. I think it's killing inclusion. I think it's killing discussion. But then there's the thing of, I'm embarrassed to say it, not because I'm scared. See, the woke thing creates fear. The thing about, I'm embarrassed means that it's wrong. Otherwise you wouldn't be embarrassed. And so I think that when you have that feeling, just shut up. Think of a better way to say it. Right? Or say, look, I'm embarrassed to say this, but. And then if you're having the right discussion, and if you've created the right culture, which we talked about before, somebody will say to you, good, you have every right to be embarrassed. Or, no, I understand it, what you're trying to say. You don't have to be embarrassed. And I think, because I've heard that side too. So I think that you just sometimes have to be honest with yourself and understand what the difference is. And I think that, I think part of it actually is this woke fear, because I think that's stopping people from feeling embarrassed, because they're so scared to say anything. They're not even thinking about this stupid stuff that they probably could control.
Right.
And I find that to be really just, I talk to young people all the time, and it's amazing how just they feel they can't express themselves, and they're not sure what to do about it. I'm working on a project, which is something we just won a big award for this, about anti-Semitism. And I've spoken to the DEI heads of probably Fortune 500, amongst other things. And it's just amazing how, when you start talking to people and they're not realizing, our whole program is about how you don't realize what you hear. It's not about pointing fingers, it's called shine a light. So it's about shining a light, not on okay, you're an anti-Semite, but shine a light on what's being said. So it's very similar to this, right?
Yes.
And I find that notion to be so important, because if you make people understand in the nicest way that what they're saying is bad or wrong or a microaggression, which is not a great word, but because I think that sets up you're great.
That's what you call micro moments.
Yeah, whatever. But I think that once you set that up and you make them realize, and they say, what are you talking about? Me? I'm an anti-Semite? Me? I'm not good to women? I don't get it? And you say, yeah, hello. So you're not really, but it's these things you're allowing to be said around you, which I think is another issue. Sometimes we allow things to be said. So you didn't actually say, you're the leader. You're sitting in the room. You say something. I didn't say it.
That's exactly right.
But I didn't shut it down.
You didn't shut it down.
And that makes me just as guilty.
It's just as guilty, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I just think that we need more honesty and openness, less finger pointing, much more hey, we're all in this together, and let's figure it out, because it's a win-win.
Awesome.
Perfect.